refuses to table a spring budget while massively increasing government spending and keeping the parliamentary budgeting officer in the dark. And just like Trudeau, this guy can't even get a tax cut right. He promised $800, yet the average Canadian will only save $90 this year. Wow. Not even enough to get a hot chocolate from Tim Hortons weekly.
I recognize the job of Prime Minister comes with many responsibilities. I didn't know addition and division were one of them. The parliamentary budget officer refers to the reductions for all Canadians. The vote that the members opposite supported this government on delivers a tax cut for the 22 million Canadians who pay taxes and drive this country forward.
That is debate in the House of Commons this afternoon on ongoing criticism towards the feds or the federal government on a lack of a spring budget. That debate comes on the heels of a brand new report from the federal budget watchdog that says without the details that come with a spring budget, he can't properly assess whether the federal government is on track to meet its fiscal targets, or at least the ones they promised during the federal election campaign. The government has recently announced $9 billion additional dollars to be spent on defense this year and a middle-class tax cut that has yet to be officially budgeted for. The report also estimates the federal deficit for the last fiscal year will hit $46 billion, about $4 billion lower than it estimated back in March, in part due to higher corporate tax revenues and the imposition of counter tariffs on the U.S. Yves Giroux is the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and he's with me live right now. Hi, Mr. Giroux. It's good to see you.
Likewise.
That budget, that deficit sort of amelioration, is it just on the revenue side primarily that changed things?
Yes, primarily due to stronger than expected corporate income tax revenues, which have consistently surprised budget watchers like me over the last several years.
Okay. When it comes to the projected deficit or lack thereof, in particular, this promise that was made very specifically during the election campaign to balance what the Liberals characterize as the operating budget in the next 3 years or over a 3-year time span. What is your take? What have you been able to assess and not assess as far as whether that's possible?
Well, it's difficult to assess because the government has yet to define what it considers or will consider to be the operating budget. Because currently we already distinguish in government accounting what is the operating budget versus the capital investment. It's already treated separately. So for the government to say we will balance the operating budget raises the question, what will be different than the current situation? The current accounting generally recognize accounting principles in accordance with what the AG recommends. So we've been accounting government expenditures, revenues like that for more than 2 decades, but the government has not yet defined what it will move from operating to capital to justify the different treatment.
So how is it divided now? Like when you, I don't think many of us in our real day-to-day life, talk that way. We just have one budget. Yep. So what in the government world over the past 2 decades, as you describe it, what's the difference between an operating and a capital budget?
So for example, if the government buys a building, which is expected to have a lifespan of, let's say, 40 years, it doesn't record the expense of the entire building. It records 1/40th of the expense every year to account for the fact that the lifespan of the building is 40 years. So that's already accounted for that way for buildings, machinery, equipment, military equipment, and so on. So that's why it's a bit difficult to assess what the government means, because we already treat capital investments in a different way.
So here's my guess, based on all of the questions that have been posed to the Minister and the Prime Minister about this. It would seem to me that they mean by operating, the spending on the operation of government, and everything else is maybe going into the capital side. Does that make sense to you? Like, is that fiscally appropriate?
I would say no is the easy answer, but we don't know exactly what they mean.
Fair, yeah.
Do they mean, for example, investment in labor market training, because that will increase the productive capacity of the economy, and they will start considering that as capital investments as opposed to operating expenditures, transfers to provinces for infrastructure. So it's anybody's guess at this point.
Fair question. I think one of the only things that we know would be included in that is perhaps the public service. And they have indicated that they see the growth in spending at 9% a year and that they would cut it to 2%. They have said that they would cap the public service. I don't know if that means the number of people or if it means the level of their salaries or anything like that. Based on what they have said they would do you have any instinct as to how much the public service would need to be cut or capped in order to achieve those objectives?
Again, it's difficult to say without having the fuller picture as to what they will mean by operating expenditures versus capital investment or the rest, to call it that way. So without having a clear picture as to what they will keep in operating and what they will shift in that new category, it's very difficult to assess how much would need to be cut.
You have a couple of their promises you've been able to now sort of officially cost out, including the tax cut that was just being debated in the House of Commons in that clip we played. What have you determined it will cost the federal government and ultimately will save Canadians?
So in terms of saving for Canadians, we estimate that on average at about $280 per year. When it comes to various situations, for example, a senior in the low-income bracket, it's about $50 per year, so a relatively low amount there. And I'm flipping through my pages because there's lots of numbers. So about $5.8 billion per year in cost to the government once it's fully implemented.
Okay, and then I think you had it at 2029 at around just over $6 billion, but it sort of gradually increases upon implementation. So if I recall, the government said it would the Liberals said that it would save us about $800+ a year, a two-income house, 800. So why is your calculation a little less?
Well, it depends on the income threshold, the income level at which you are. But for a couple at above the first income bracket, let's say they hit the second income bracket at about $50,000, $60,000, then the savings would be up to or close to $800 per year.
So it's the top end estimate that they were presenting, essentially.
Yes.
Okay. And then finally, I did want to ask you also about defense spending, because you had produced a report a number of months ago that was kind of used as our benchmark when we talked about if we do achieve the target set out by NATO, how much will it cost? And we were looking, I think, at $40 billion, like a doubling essentially of what the budget was. They are now saying that they can meet that in this fiscal year by spending an additional $9 billion, a bunch of different factors, including basically GDP not being the size that was anticipated. Does that track from a fiscal perspective?
Yes, it does. When we said it would cost $40 billion, or it would mean $40 billion more, that would mean attaining or reaching that level by 2030. Now the government has said we'll reach it this year. Considering the level of spending on defense right now, that means that an additional $9 billion will allow them to reach that 2% target. But it will have to be increased year after year because it's 2% of GDP, and GDP grows with inflation and economic growth. So every year that goes by, the government will need to increase commensurately its defense spending to maintain the 2%.
And just you stole my follow-up, because we don't know the exact level of GDP or what the growth will be like, but do you anticipate it will ever be, just $9 billion that will get us there again, or will the numbers eventually be much bigger?
Eventually, the number might have to be much bigger. And the important point to keep in mind is it's not the amounts allocated to defense, it's the amounts that actually get spent on defense that matters for NATO.
Well, and it matters in this country because often there's a big discrepancy between the two in the past under multiple governments, I will point out.
Yes, it's always been a struggle to meet to spend all the allocations.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I got to leave it there. Mr. Giroux, thank you so much. A pleasure as always.
Always a pleasure.
Yves Giroux is the Parliamentary Budget Officer.